What's up, everybody? Welcome in to a much anticipated edition
Mm,
of SSPN recaps. Now, if you would have talked to me a month ago, I would have assumed that this would have been an SSPN post game episode. But Ethan, you were able to go to the game last night, and I also didn't get off work until around 7. So I missed about the first half of the game. So we
mm.
decided, hey, we'll record Friday afternoon, do a little pre recorded episode. We haven't done one of these in a while and kind of break everything down. So let's just jump right into it, man. I know we're going to get into a lot of stuff. There's a lot of different storylines from this game. And I think before we get into everything, it's probably a good idea to say everything is kind of with the asterisk of it's just one game.
Mhm.
But there's definitely, I'm sure, some stuff that we'll get into. But before we get into the specific different little topics, I think let's just ask you from the man himself who was in the building last night in the American, is it the American Airlines Arena? Or is that Miami?
American Airlines Center in Dallas.
Center. There you go. Thank you for correcting me there. You were in the building last night, Ethan.
I
What were your
was.
takeaways from the environment? What you saw on the court from being in the arena?
Well, the environment was electric, but unfortunately, it was electric in Dallas's favor. I was not amongst a lot of Spurs fans. There were some. I saw a few DeMar DeRozan jerseys, a few Wemby jerseys, mostly from young people. Actually, not. I was expecting more old people, but
Hmm.
honestly, it was a competitive first half. I felt like definitely there were some negatives. We can get into those. But my overall feeling was Dallas is just missing shots. I think at halftime they had taken 10 to 15 more shots than us, and they were just shooting like 25% from three. So I was like, they're getting the looks, they're just not falling down. And then that third quarter run that we saw from Luca, Kyrie, Clay Thompson, who finally played well, that really kind of propelled Dallas forward ultimately to win the game. But I felt like there were some solid things. It really felt like a classic case of rust from Victor Wembanyama, from
Yeah.
Chris Paul. And then obviously the absence of Devin Vassell was definitely big because we were just missing a scorer. It felt like Wemby and Chris were kind of having to force things, and they never looked quite comfortable. Wemby, the physicality from Derek Lively and Gafford was kind of getting to him, trying to do a little bit too much, and then you add that rust element on top of it, and it just never quite looked like we were comfortable. Um,
Yeah.
and quite frankly, it felt like the Dallas Mavericks were going to win pretty much the entire game, even when it was competitive in that first half.
That's interesting. Definitely interesting to hear from, someone who was in the building and really saw the stuff on the court because as much as we love the TV copy and there's definitely some things that you can pick and take from there,
Hmm.
when you're in the building, there's definitely, some other feelings and different things that you can pick up because probably from a lot of Spurs fans who are watching this game live, as much as it maybe, wasn't the prettiest first half, the thought process could be, okay, we didn't play our best half and we're still up by 2.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear your context of like kind of in the building. It kind of always felt like eventually it was going to shift into the Mavericks' favor, and that's definitely what happened in the second half, which is mainly what I got to see. So for full
Hmm.
context, I didn't really sit down and start watching the game live until about 8.5 minutes left in the third quarter. But this morning, because it was actually on TNT, I was able to go back and watch the TV copy. So I got the full context of how everything went kind of in those first 2 quarters. And I definitely agree with your sentiment there. And that's not just to sit here and us always agree, but like it wasn't the prettiest first half from
Yeah.
us offensively. There were definitely some bright spots. I think Julian Champagnie was a
Hmm.
big bright spot last night. I think you could say the same for Jeremy Sohan and Harrison Barnes as well.
For sure.
But at the same time, it wasn't like we were out there running like super efficient sets, like a bunch of organized offense. There was a ton of transition play. And you look at the number, let me see the exact total here 19 turnovers on the
Yeah.
night for the Spurs. There were a lot of possessions that unfortunately were wasted because of turnovers last night. And, it's again, like I said at the beginning of the video, it's one game. So we're not going to have like these concrete big takeaways. We'll probably
Right.
be like we were last year, around Christmas is probably when we'll, start to have like some concrete thoughts on things. Um, but at the same time, I was kind of expecting, and if you just look at the box score and you see 8 assists for Chris Paul, you might be like, oh well, he was probably out there orchestrating, and that wasn't necessarily the case. There was a lot of still free flowing basketball,
Mhm,
a lot of stuff honestly kind of similar to the past 2 seasons, and it's going to take time for people to, for Harrison Barnes and Chris Paul to mesh together, as well as the guys who are already on the team to learn how to play with them. I know we've had some preseason games, but the intensity is different in the regular season. That's something we talked about all
mhm,
preseason. Um, so I was just, that was something that I was expecting a little more of that I didn't see last night. Again, it's one game, but here's one thing that's interesting, Ethan, that you probably didn't hear because you were in the stadium. Now, maybe you were able to see a little bit of the TV copy. I'm not sure. Even if you
mhm,
did, I'm sure you were probably focused on the court. That's what I would have done. Um, but they did have Pop on audio in the huddle, and he literally said, "There are no plays." And he was kind of saying it like adamantly.
mhm,
Um, and I get that to an extent. And here, let me, before I say this, another preface here.
mhm.
Me and Ethan, we're always going to defer to the Spurs front office and Greg Popovich. Like, we're not trying to sit here and act like we know more basketball than them. We'd just be lying. You know
Right.
what I mean? If we were
Yeah.
sitting here trying to say that. But also, one of the things that we've been talking about and have been super excited about coming into this year, especially since the Chris Paul signing, was orchestrated sets, organized offense, stuff like that. So when I hear Pop in the huddle saying there are no plays, um, I'm the first guy to defend Pop, Ethan, especially. I've done it numerous times on this show, but that's something that I'm like, I get wanting to be free flowing in the pace and space era, and I think there's a time and place for that on this team. Like we talk
Mhm.
about Keldon Johnson, for example, and his strength is in transition. Now I know he didn't have the greatest game last night, but I'm just using that as an example of somebody who excels in transition on our team. Even Wemby and Jeremy running and catching lobs, stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
But also, to really take that next step, we can't just be dribbling around aimlessly trying to create something like we have been for the past 2 seasons, you know.
Mhm.
So I would like to see some plays run. With Chris Paul at the helm, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. But also at the end of the day, I realize that we're sitting here doing this podcast, and those guys, RC Buford and Greg Popovich orchestrated, the longest playoff run in NBA history. So I'm not going to sit
Yeah.
here and try to, act like I know more than them. But also when I heard that in the huddle, man, like I'm like, and then you see the turnovers and kind of how there isn't that much structure last night.
Mhm.
It kind of makes me frustrated. Now we'll see what happens when Devin comes back too. That's another huge caveat to this game with Devin Vassell being out. But since you probably didn't hear that, Ethan, what are your thoughts on Pop saying that in the huddle on like the TNT audio?
Yeah, I didn't hear that on the TNT audio, but it's something that he's continually said, I think, throughout training camp and last year, the year before, and it's just been like an ongoing theme. And I get it. When you look back at the 2014 beautiful game, it pretty much it was that for the most part, right? It was free flowing, it was instinctual basketball, but that was a team that had a lot of chemistry and a lot of years together with Tony, Manu, Tim, and then the rest of the veterans surrounding them. They knew where everybody was going to be, and it was just instant reaction, right? We're not at that point yet, and I think that's why it's ugly. And to your point, you bring in a guy like Chris Paul, whose number one skill is being a old school point guard in the half court with sets, guys running off of pin downs and really controlling the offense. And we're not quite doing that. So I understand your frustration. I understand the rest of the Spurs frustrations, and I'm a little frustrated at that too. The only thing I'm gonna give Pop is that maybe he's just waiting for Devin to kind of unlock that, and
That was something I had that I was maybe going to say later after you talked, but yeah.
that could be something that could be an element to that. But also, Chris Paul talked about in his post game that it's an adjustment for him, and he made several. Excuse me. He made several mistakes as far as not cutting through, not running without the basketball, because it's an adjustment for him. And so he said, "I'm going to get better at that. We'll get better at that, and our chemistry overall will improve." So if that happens, I think maybe it's a mute point.
Right.
But I definitely understand where you're coming from. But the one thing that I did see kind of translate with the addition of Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes, it wasn't necessarily set plays, but there was definitely a like a definitive action to slow
Yeah.
the ball down and at least attempt to get it to Wemby in the post.
Yes.
Now, Lively and Gafford, like I said, were really banging him low, pushing him off the block. Honestly, probably could have gotten a few more calls his way. Well, we don't have to talk about that. Just one game. And obviously it didn't work because Wemby shot 5 for 18, 1 for 8 from three. But I did see that drive to get him the ball down low because of Chris Paul and Harrison.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that I think kind of ties into that point is, and this is something I still saw tonight, there was more intent for ball movement. Like,
That's a great
yes,
word. Yeah.
at the same time, like I'm mentioning how there were all these turnovers, there were some ugly possessions, that were reminiscent of the past two seasons, but also kind of like we saw in preseason, guys with, like I said, more intention to move the
Yeah.
ball. We saw, we still saw 3, 4, 5 pass possessions, throughout this game. So that is something that I think is a good sign. You brought up the Devin point. I mentioned how that's kind of a key thing, whenever it comes to talking about tonight. Now, that's not to say that if Devin Vassell played this game, that the Spurs would have won and everything would have been perfect. But
Yeah.
also, I think unequivocally, it's easy to say that he's our second best player. And, I mean, I was going to say, really, probably our best isolation scorer as well. I know, obviously, Victor has the potential to be that. But I think as of right now, and, I say this, and in 3 games, Victor could look like he did last season. And then I'm like, okay, no. But regardless, you get my point. Our other option, other than Victor, who is the main ISO guy on the team, is Devin Vassell. And
Yeah.
so him being out, definitely has an impact on the game for sure. And like you said as
1000%.
well, with Pop, maybe when he comes back in, we're running off ball screens for him to come off of, with Chris Paul kind of telling people where to go and orchestrating things. Maybe that is the case. And it's just kind of in these first 5 games, we're kind of playing this more free flowing style until Devin gets back. But also to your point that you just mentioned, because Pop has kind of harped on that so much over the past couple seasons, it kind of makes me feel like that is what we're going to end up doing, even when Devin does get back. But with that being said, Devin coming back will also just probably make that style of offense look a little bit better
For sure.
because of the significance that he has to this team's offense.
And you know what's funny? If Wemby has a normal game, we're
It,
probably having a different conversation. Like it all comes down to that. Wembenyama shooting 5 of 18, 1 for 8, and really just rusty and getting brutalized down low with those 4 turnovers. This was a bad game for him. I'm gonna say
yes,
this was
yes,
a bad game for Victor Wembanyama. Would Devin Vassell's presence have fixed a lot of that? For sure. Would him playing better have resulted in a different outcome? Probably. So I know these are all what ifs and
right.
what could have been, but I just want to like keep that in context. If he plays better, everybody looks better, and we're not having such a negative conversation today.
So I had 3 points, Ethan, that before I even watched the first half, I kind of took away from what I saw in the end of the game last night, the majority of the second half that I got to watch. And as much as there was some more context that I learned from the first half watching the game, these 3 points still stayed the same with me. And we've already kind of talked about 2 of them here. And I want to dive a little bit more. I mean, you kind of already said what you said on Victor, and I agree for the most part. And that's something that I'm sure a lot of people will want to talk about. But let me just read these 3 points to finish that thought. So the first thought I have on this game, no Devin Vassell. We just
Yep.
kind of talked about that. 2, Wemby bad game. You
Mm.
just summarized that perfectly. I think the only thing I'll add is I think other than the Rockets game last year, I think those are his 2 worst games that I've watched. I know the box score is a little bit better tonight, but just personally for me, that those are the 2 worst games that I've seen from him. And just to touch on that before I get to the third point, Wemby said last night that uh, conditioning wise, last game was a rough game for him. He also there was an article came out today from Jeff McDonald, excuse me, of the San Antonio News Express, where he said that or where he had a quote from Victor that said it's probably going to take him 1 to 2 games to get back into rhythm. And you talked about how he looked rusty. You texted me that before I'd even watched the game last night, and that's actually the first note that I have on here from watching the first half earlier today, is that he did look rusty and he did look gassed even
He did.
early in the game. So when he's making the conditioning comments, and then he's also making the comments about how it's going to take him a little bit to get into rhythm, I don't want to just completely make that, an excuse, but also it's one game. And I think we've seen enough from this guy and know his talent level, on top of the fact that he just had a super long summer. Again,
Mhm.
I get that you can say that's excuses, but I feel like, we're going to be back to how we talked about Victor last year, probably by mid-November,
Yeah.
and maybe I'll be proven wrong on that. And it'll be a little bit of a struggle to start this season, maybe because of the long summer. But I think with those comments combined in context, I think that's pretty telling for the way that he played last night. But I agree with you; it was a bad game from him. We're not going to say that often, but I'll say that as well. And then my third and final point, just to wrap this up, and I think this honestly is more important than Devin and Wemby, because I think if both of them are on the floor, if Wemby has a good game and Devin's on the floor, I think this point still rings true. The Mavs are coming off a finals run and added Clay,
Right.
who looked, I know it's one game again, Clay looks really good. And when you have, Kyrie and Luca around him, that's going to make his life so much easier for his skill set. You can say it's older Clay, blah, blah, blah. He played bad last year. There are so many games that he lost the Warriors in clutch moments, people were saying, right? But
Mhm.
now that he's next to these two guys, and, the athleticism and having to put the ball on the floor, that doesn't matter as much. He can just be a sniper. And honestly, I think athletically last night, again, one game, he looked better as well.
Mhm.
Anyways, that's a little side rant there on Klay Thompson. But the point is, the Mavs are coming off a finals run and just added Klay.
Yeah.
Okay. And at best, even with the Spurs fully healthy, Ethan, our prediction is they're a play-in team. Even if that's 7-8 and we want to go like super over the top positivity for the Spurs, I think both of you and I would agree, as we said in our preseason predictions, this is a play-in team at best. So at the end of the day, it's a team competing for championships,
Yep.
coming off a finals run, versus a team who at best is in the play-in.
100%. Context is extremely important here. And the Mavericks did play very, very well, especially in that second half.
Second
Like
half.
they were executing to the best of their ability. And it didn't help that our pick and roll defense, as it was last year,
Right.
was pretty atrocious. Just trying to stop Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks. But I do have 2 points here to make. One high level point that's negative, and then I'll do a couple positives, and then I'll kick it back to you, Jude. The high level negative, I think our bench not having a true scorer, especially if we're not going to play Malachi, is really going to hurt us. Even when Devin Vassell returns, because as much as I love Keldon and I believe in his ability to be a six man, he's not an off the dribble scorer. He's really a slasher, get to the hole, a great cutter, handoff guy going downhill. But he's
Catch and
not gonna,
shoot.
yeah, he's not gonna break you down and score in the mid range. He's not gonna take you to the post. Like that's not his game. I
Yeah.
don't think that's Zach's game. I don't think that's Trey's game. And right now, it's not Stephon Castle's game. It will be eventually. We both think
Yeah.
he has that potential, but we don't have that guy currently. So I don't know what the fix is there. I just think it's something that we need to be aware of, kind of going into this season. It's going to have to be something that we address. But then a couple positives. Julian Champagnie, like you'd mentioned, shooting 4 of 8 from three, lights out, pretty solid defense. Jeremy Sohan, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but
I have,
defensively,
well,
he
yeah.
played very well on Luka Doncic, and Luka's overall numbers weren't efficient. They were still good, but he was not efficient, and his physicality against Luka is always felt. Luka's often been frustrated by Jeremy Sohan. I would
9
say
for
that
25, Luca went.
9 for 25. Thank you, Jude. So shout out Jeremy. And I know it was frustrating. I think he had a couple fouls early. He did have 18 points as well. So offensively, he was everywhere. And I was sitting next to a coworker of mine who doesn't know anything about the Spurs. And he was like, "Who's this number 10? This Dennis Rodman lookalike?" And I was like, "Oh, it's Jeremy Sohan." And he was like, "He is in every effing play." And I was like, "He is." Yeah. He's like, he just everywhere that the ball is, he's there. And he was taking advantage of his opportunities. So shout out Jeremy. And then Harrison, like you'd mentioned, 7 of 10, 2 of 5 from three. early on, he was our only offense. I think he got to 12 points extremely fast,
He
and nobody
bailed
else
us
could
out
score.
so many times. Sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
you're fine.
that was something I noticed in the first quarter, dude. There were
Mm.
so many aimless possessions, and luckily, we just happened to have Harrison Barnes open on the wing or in the corner, and he would bail us out of a possession.
Yes. So shout out him, that veteran presence proving worthy, at least for this season. Um, And then lastly, Stefan Castle, he wasn't perfect, but I think defensively he was very solid. He was got a couple times on some Luca fakes, some Luca slowdowns, but he took up the challenge, and I felt like he was really physical, especially when he first got into the game. I think he forced Luca to miss a couple of shots, like when he first checked into the game, that I was able to notice. And then he had an unbelievable dime in
Yeah.
fourth quarter trash time. He had finished with 5 assists, a couple turnovers, but only -3 in the plus minus, which is technically pretty good compared to the rest of his teammates.
Yeah, that midi he hit in the third
Yes,
quarter that was kind of off the dribble
that's pretty.
was very tough as well. Again, not the most efficient game from Castle, but if you've listened to SSPN long enough, you know that me and Ethan are not just box score worshippers,
Yeah.
I guess is how I'll put it. And I think Stephon Castle definitely passed the eye test last night. Obviously, he's a rookie. There's going to be rookie things that we see.
Mhm.
But I had a very similar sentiment. And honestly, my thought was like, okay, we definitely need to give him spot minutes like
Yes.
throughout the year, or maybe even have him, full time as the backup too. Now, what you said to start this off about the bench scoring, I think that's a very fair point too. And that ties into something else that I was thinking about. I'm going to get into some of the other stuff that you talked about because there's so many different things that you could dive
Mhm.
into with this game. But the way that Julian Champagny played tonight,
Yeah.
or last night, excuse me, um, I know we were harping for Mamu to be the backup four. Um, Maybe this is a one game overreaction. I know I said everything we say is a caveat with one game, but I
Mhm.
really feel like from what we've seen from Julian over the past 2 seasons, and I know preseason was just preseason, but also what we saw in preseason, um, I think he's somebody who should consistently be in the rotation. And you were
Mhm.
talking about, I'm not saying he's the fix, but with what he did tonight, and just kind of his game, we even saw him drive past PJ Washington, take him off the dribble, and go dunk at the rim on top of shooting 50% from three and hitting some contested ones too. Had
Yeah.
some wide open ones as well, but there was one in the left corner where he had a dude in his face, was fading out of bounds, and just splashed it. Julian being in that backup rotation instead of Mamu Kelishvili, I think maybe could give us some scoring ability there. Just if even with Keldon's driving to the rim, if they leave Champagny open. Now, granted, what I will say is if Champagny's on the bench, they're probably going to key in on him more. Which probably wouldn't make his scoring opportunities as easy as he gets in the starting lineup. Um, but I think my main takeaway that I'm trying to go with here is I think I would rather play Julian than Mamu off the
Mm.
bench. And basically what I had, and this ties into rotation questions, when Devin comes back, obviously CP3, Devin, Harrison, Jeremy, Victor in the starting
Mhm.
lineup, right? Then Trey, Steph. Honestly, I have some Blake spot minutes here too.
Me
I kind
too.
of want to get your thoughts on that. I wouldn't mind having spot minutes for Blake and Steph, kind of mixing them as the backup too. But I would probably still prioritize Steph as much as I have a lot of belief in Blake Wesley still and like his development. But then Keldon, Julian, and Zach. And the Spurs official roster has Julian Champagny listed at 6'8", and think about last night. We're playing the Mavericks. PJ Washington, well, he's a starter, but a lot of times I remember there was one lineup where it was kind of like mainly our bench lineup, and
Mhm.
PJ Washington was on the floor. He's 6'7", right? Keldon or Julian can kind of match up with him. Now, maybe it might be better to put Keldon on him because maybe physically and strength wise, he could match up with him in the post a little bit more. But
Mm.
even then, with the strength disadvantage that Julian would have against him, he would still have the length, to guard somebody like that. The point is, I don't think that that's that much of a size disadvantage in the modern NBA off the bench playing Keldon and Julian at the forward spots, if that makes sense.
It does 100%. I agree with everything that you said. The only difference I have in my bench rotations, Jude, would be instead of taking away Stefan Castle's minutes for some spot minutes for Blake, I would take away some Trey Jones minutes for Blake Wesley.
Ooh,
As much as I love Trey Jones and
I think
everything
I
he does,
completely agree there.
because we've seen what Blake and Stefan sharing a backcourt looks like. I know it was just preseason, like you've continually said, but defensively, it's nightmarish for the opposing team's backcourt. They're really fast, tempo is up, and they're both really solid playmakers. They have become really solid playmakers, and that was the harp on why we played Trey Jones over those two guys. But if they're gonna play efficiently, how many turnovers did they have? Steph had 2, Blake had 0, Trey also had 0. I'll take the 2 of them and then sacrifice a few of Trey Jones minutes.
Now that you've said that, you've convinced me. I don't have a counter because I really didn't want to take away any of Stefan's minutes, to be honest. And Trey Jones didn't even play bad last night, but I think that there's just some things that Blake has physically, mainly speed,
Mhm.
as well as his defense. I think that comes a little bit more natural to him.
Mhm.
That he kind of, you can make the argument that he has on Trey. I think he might be able to push the pace a little bit more. You might have some more mistakes that you'll have to work through just with Blake Wesley getting real rotation minutes. But,
Yeah.
I mean, as much as we love Trey Jones is on an expiring contract.
Yeah.
Maybe this is where, you kind of start giving Blake some minutes there, to kind of fit him into that role. Because if Chris Paul is gone after this year, Stefan's probably going to move up into that point guard position, like we've been talking about.
Mhm.
So that once again leaves a hole on the bench for the backup point guard position, unless we bring Trey Jones back, and then you could have Trey and Blake in the backcourt. But that is so far ahead, thinking in 2025 terms. But to get back to just the game a little bit, Ethan, I'm going to just read some of my other notes that I had here from the first half. So, like we talked about, Wemby looked rusty. We weren't running orchestrated sets. There was lots of transition play, which unfortunately led to a good bit of careless turnovers, which is frustrating because that was a theme that we've seen over the past 2 years. Here's another thought we haven't talked about yet. I think for sure, regardless of what we want, I think we were just wrong on this. I think Zach's going to be the backup center. I just don't think that Charles is going to compete for minutes.
Yeah, especially when he's only getting 6 in a game where Zach wasn't even playing well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, us thinking there's a competition there, we were just off on that straight up. And also, there has been a lot of injuries for Bassie. He only played 6 minutes last night in garbage time, but I think he still needs to get his feet under him, is how I would describe it. It doesn't
Mhm.
seem like he's moving the same way that he used to. And that could be a combination of injuries and just getting back on the floor. We'll have to see how that plays out. I'm not like completely giving up on Charles, but I think that Zach's going to be the backup center. We just have to deal with that and accept it. Um, the other thing I had written down was Julian, Steph, and maybe even Blake may need some PT. We already talked about that. Um, we didn't play our best half, and we won both quarters in the first half. That's one little positive you can hang on to. But also, this is something you touched on earlier, and I wanted to bring this up. I think that also has to do with the way that the Mavs shot in the first half. There was a statistic that they put up on TNT. In the first half, Luka was like 3 for 14.
Mhm.
Kyrie was 3 for 7, and Klay Thompson was 3 for 8. Maybe I got some of the field goal percentages mixed up there, but the point is, their three, stars were not shooting well in the first half, and then they started to in the second half, and then they went up 20. I know it kind of got a little bit close there at the end because it was garbage time, and our young guys like Blake Wesley were playing hard out there, and trying to cut into it a little bit, but the game was already over at that point. So really they kind of put their foot on our throat in the second half. And I kind of see it as a 20-point win for them because that's really kind of what they did when everybody was out on the floor.
Mhm.
Um, the next thing I have written down, the Mavs stars didn't shoot well in the first half. We just talked about that. One thing that I also had written down, we left Klay open too much. But also the other thing I want to say, that goes back to just like the nature of these two teams. Like,
Mhm.
is it a realistic thing to ask this roster to cover Klay Thompson while also trying to cover Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic while Devin Vassell is out?
Really difficult.
Probably, yeah, that's probably just what was going to happen anyway for where the Spurs are at right now. I
Mhm.
understand it is a different standard for the Spurs this year. I think both you and I would agree with that.
Mhm.
But also, this is a team that went to the finals last year. Like, they're just better than us, straight up. Um, Again, Harrison bailed us out on a lot of our first quarter possessions. And then the second half, the Mavs just came out with much more intensity in the second half. And then Luka and Klay started going off. But those are all the notes that I kind of had written down, and I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, well done, Jude. Despite the Mavericks being way better than us, and for the record, the Mavericks are my second favorite team, so I cheer for them whenever they aren't playing the Spurs. I made a bet with some of my friends. The Spurs will win a ring before the Dallas Mavericks do.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Because I don't know if they can do it, Jude. I just don't know if they can do it.
Interesting. I kind of, again, one game, I kind of feel like they might be able to. That was my that was my sentiment after last night. Again, one game, and that goes back to the Klay Thompson thing. But if Klay Thompson can keep sniping off the ball and
Yeah,
Kyrie and Luka do their thing, I mean, think about last year. I mean, they went to the finals. How many games was the finals last year? Is it 6 games?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Let's see,
Was it
2025
5?
finals results.
I'm glad that you don't remember too. That makes me feel better.
They won 4-1.
Okay, so it was 5 games, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I don't know if that's going to make a difference against the Celtics, but the point I'm trying to say is having, another 20 points like Klay Thompson, that these defenses have to deal with, I think that's going to make the Mavericks better. But we'll see. Again, this
Mm,
is all one game. We don't need to get into a whole Mavericks discussion.
right.
Here's how we can end this episode off, Ethan, because we will be back Monday, if I remember correctly, to
Mhm.
do the Mavericks game, or excuse me, the Rockets game, the second game in the back to back. But we will not be doing a post game for Saturday's back to back. So just give me your little preview thoughts, what you'd like to see on the Saturday Rockets game, since we won't have any content out on it.
Yeah, I'd like to see some better communication defensively from the entire team. Some better tempo play. I feel like the Mavericks did a good job stifling our speed and youth. And then just overall from Wemby, less rust, more comfortable. Keep it simple. Don't over dribble.
Less turnovers, Wemby playing better. I could
Yeah.
go into a whole spiel about it, but that's really it. Okay, one last thought because we didn't really touch on this, and I'm curious your thoughts on it. What did you think of the team defense last night, just overall?
It was good enough, but it could be better. I still feel like communication off pick and rolls is really bad. We saw several miscommunications that resulted in wide open threes for Klay Thompson, like you just talked about, as well as Kyrie Irving, and Jaden Hardy knocked a couple down in our face. He had a really good game. So that's going to be our biggest pain point. The rest of it was solid. I feel like individually it was good. It's just pick and roll. But again, it's Luka Doncic. It's Kyrie Irving. These guys are pretty much impossible to stop in that situation, but just something to keep your eye on.
Yeah, I guess the way that I would describe it is like all the things that you just mentioned. There's definitely things we still need to work on and learn and continue to grow and develop on. But I
Mhm.
saw some little tidbits here and there that I felt like were a little bit better, especially in the first half. And like we said, some of that was just them shooting poorly, but also, like you mentioned, I think Jeremy Sohan, for example,
And yeah.
did a really solid job on Luka Doncic in the first half. And another thing that I thought about, I know we're here at the end. I want to wrap this up. But you know how, I mean, over all these years, we've been talking about how Jeremy Sohan is still going to pick up a lot of these ball handlers, regardless of where his position has been. And I just would like to say that that continues to ring true as
Mm.
he's guarding Luka Doncic. And I'm sure he'll probably be put on Shea Gilgeous-Alexander because I don't think we're going to put Chris Paul on those two guys.
No, yeah, there's no way. And I'm sure he'll probably guard Jalen Green. You think he'll guard Jalen
Yeah,
Green? I would say
probably.
so, especially with Devin not being
Hmm.
available.
Yep. Yep. Completely agree there. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. But I want to just give another shout out to Jeremy because I think he played a really solid game last night.
Yep.
And there were times where, how do I put this? I think his effort was consistent throughout the game where maybe the entire roster, it wasn't the same. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, he played with very, very high intensity. And if Wemby plays a better game, so does Jeremy Sohan. I think they kind of play together.
I completely agree, and I think that ties into what your Mavericks fan friend was
Mhm.
saying there in the stadium as well. But anyways, we appreciate you guys. Thanks for checking out this episode of SSPN Recaps. We will be back with our first official, real, regular, live post game, literally right after the game next Monday in the second half of the back to back against the Houston Rockets. We're excited for that one. Unfortunately, we're going to miss that first Rockets game, but still, I'm excited for these Rockets games, and I'm
Mm.
excited that our first post game can kind of be after that rivalry, because those games are always just a little bit more intense and a little bit more fun. So, again, we appreciate you guys. If you guys enjoy the content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button below. We're going to be putting out Spurs content all season long. We're excited for this year, regardless of how it turns out. And if you want to stay updated with the show, follow us on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, at SSPN on YT, at Jude McLaren, and at Ethan_Quintero. And one last thing. I saw that recently we had somebody go order some more merch. So we truly appreciate any of you guys that buy our merch. You see Ethan's rope cap. That's actually what somebody else got on our last order. And if you want to check out the shop, go to sspn.spreadshop.com. The link is in the description, or you can scan the QR code here. Again, we appreciate you guys. We'll catch you on the next one. See y'all Monday. Go Spurs, go.